Jenny Sheets.
Yes.
We're starting. It's happening. I said I was going to roll right into it, and here we are. Jenny, what do you do here at Houston's First?
So I'm on staff with Legacy 68.5, which is our adoption, foster, and orphan care ministry at Houston's First. We are involved at all of our campuses. We serve adoptive families, foster families, and then global partners who serve orphan and vulnerable children across the world, and that is my specific role. So all of our partnerships with ministries that either equip families who are adopting and fostering, ministries that actually provide care for children, that we partner with in some capacity is my role to manage those partnerships and build those connections and help equip them and resource them.
How long have you been doing this?
Officially about 1.5 years, but I've been a volunteer for Legacy since 2012.
Yeah, I was going to say, my first week here, I did the trauma training that you and Tony do. And I need to take it again because I was also like, I'd just moved here. And
it was a trial by fire.
Yeah. I was in my own trauma, taking a trauma course. And so we need to talk about that. You guys are some of the most brilliant people on our staff because you guys are teaching us all the things that I think we need to know to relate. I guess maybe the big term is to like kids from hard places, kids that have been through trauma.
Yeah.
And specifically today, we're going to talk about the element that attachment plays in all of that. And I kind of want to let you loose. Like, what is attachment? For those of us that's a new word for us, what is it and why is it important?
That's a great question. So I think often we think of attachment in romantic relationships, which isn't necessarily wrong. But for the purposes of our talk today, we're talking about attachment between a parent and a child. So that's the intimate emotional connection between a parent and a child. Basically, the quality of that relationship, how attached your child is to you. And the depth of that emotional connection and that parent's attunement to their child's needs and ability to meet those needs.
Okay, interesting. I'm trying to put this in my own terms and trying to relate it. I mean, there's a sense in which that builds, in different stages and phases. And I think there's a point. I mean, I'm just talking as a guy. I've got a 7-year-old and a 9-year-old and an 11, soon to be 12-year-old. And there's this weird sense that I've always said to young parents, you put a lot of emphasis on kind of the young parenting stage, and like I'm investing and investing and investing in my child who like needs that for sure. And I'm no expert on attachment, but my estimation is that most parents put a lot of emphasis and priority on those early stages, and then somehow drift out of intentionality in like the middle years. And there's a like no adult that I know relates to a middle school like 100%. Like a middle schooler,
yeah, it's hard.
It's a weird phase. It's a super weird phase. And so so I'm sure the different phases play into it. Like, how is a healthy attachment formed?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm also not an expert on attachment, just to clarify. But this is something we talk about so much because it's so important, especially with adoptive families. But it's something that's super pivotal just for all families, for healthy relationships to be formed between a parent and a child. So your primary attachment is formed in the first 365 days of life. So that first year is super crucial. And the way that a healthy attachment is formed is by a parent consistently meeting a child's needs with delight. So every time a child has a need, their body produces cortisol, which is the stress hormone, and it basically tells their brain, there's something wrong, I need somebody to come help me. And that makes them cry. And when they cry, ideally, their parent or their caregiver responds. They come to their aid and they solve the problem. They meet whatever that need is, whether they need a diaper change, whether they need a bottle, whether they just need comfort. They need somebody to pick them up and hold them. And when we meet those needs, their brain produces the opposite hormones and helps it calm down. And so it closes that loop. And after that happens again and again and again and again, literally hundreds of thousands of times in the first year of life, it forms essentially the basis for trust.
Wow.
So it's also referred to as the trust cycle. That's how we form trust with children.
Man.
It's how children form their basic belief systems about the world, whether or not the world is a safe place, whether or not people are good and trustworthy, whether we can count on them to meet our needs, and whether or not they have value and worth as a person. Because of the way that as parents or caregivers, we meet those physical and emotional needs that they have.
My mind is blown.
It's super important.
Because I'm scrambling to remember what it was like raising kids. So early on, the big thing is eating, sleeping, diaper change, I guess comfort, and those kinds of things. And I can remember, this is so funny, I'm putting myself on blast here, because I'm just kind of a regular, simple guy. And so we had books that we were reading, and we had friends and all these kinds of things. But I remember what it was like to have a child. My first child, for example, he's about to turn 12. His name's Kipton, and he was like a miracle baby. Like, he slept through the night at 6 weeks and then like never looked back, and it was great, and it was really never a big problem. And simple Mark thought, so my second child, we just need to make it to 6 weeks. And I remember being frustrated with my second child, Caden, because it took him more like, I think my wife and I disagree on this, but I feel like it was more like 6 months before he was sleeping, like consistently sleeping through the night. She probably would say a little bit less, and for sure she did a lot more of that work of waking up in the middle of the night than I did. But I can remember vividly having the conversation, do we let them cry it out or do we go get them? And I'm sure if you ask 100 different people, you'll get 100 different responses, but that has to like play into that. And so maybe that's why the people who'd say like, absolutely not, you can't just let them cry it out because that attachment loop is essentially not closing.
Absolutely.
And I'm just thinking about, okay, so kids who grow up maybe in the foster adoption situation, multiple different families, probably different scenarios of care and attachment building. So those kids are going to have more unique situations because they possibly didn't get the same kind of care at the different households and places they lived in by their families. And so, gosh, so you're a person, this is just my guess, you're the kind of person that when someone acts a certain way, you're probably like automatically in your head like, I wonder what their childlike was like.
I hope so.
Yeah.
Not always, but yes.
It plays into it.
It absolutely does.
My goodness. Okay. So what are all the reasons that it's important for us to know about this and like how, we can learn more about that?
Yeah, so when we're talking specifically about adoptive and foster children, one thing that we know is especially critical for them is for us to meet their needs consistently because they already have attachment ruptures. Right. They've already been removed from their primary caregivers. So especially for kids from those kinds of contexts, cry it out can be especially harmful for them because they don't have a safe attachment to anybody. They don't have trust with a person. So especially in those kinds of contexts, we want to make sure that we're meeting their needs consistently as often as possible. When we're talking about biological families, we still want to do that. We want to make sure that kids are getting their needs met and that they're building that trust and learning by the way that we respond to their needs that they have value and worth. There are other things that attachment builds as well. So many of the building blocks of actual brain development are based on this primary attachment relationship. So we've already talked a little bit about trust, but another thing that attachment builds is voice. And by voice, I don't necessarily mean like my ability to speak verbally, although you do learn that from your first caregivers. But when we're talking about voice, we're really talking about our ability to use our voice and our words to get our needs met and to communicate what we like, what we don't like, what we want, what we don't want. When I have a problem or I'm upset about something, am I able to actually communicate that in a way that's healthy or not? And if not, then I have to use my behavior to get my needs met because nobody has valued my voice.
Wow.
And so the first way that we do that as babies, they come out and they don't have language, right? They don't come out of the womb saying, "Excuse me, I need a diaper change. Please come over here," right? They cry. And so when they cry, that is them using their voice to get their needs met. And so as often as possible, when we can respond with delight, and delight is defined as I see you and I love what I see, not based on what I do, but just on the fact that I exist. And so delighting in our children as we meet their needs actually gives them the ability, it builds that foundational skill of then using their voice to get their needs met. They know that when they say something or they need something or they don't like something, they can use their voice in order to be heard instead of having to use big behavior, which is something that we often see when kids don't get their needs met. When they do cry and nobody responds, if that happens often enough, the first thing that is shut off is that voice, their ability to understand that they can get their needs met by using their actual voice. And then it affects their trust with those adults around them. We also carry our attachment pattern or our attachment style all the way into our adulthood. And so however our parents met our needs as infants and children, subconsciously we parent or give care out of that exact same style. So whether our parents did a great job of doing that and we have what's called a secure attachment, or maybe there was a little bit more to be desired, maybe our parents were trying to work really hard to provide for us, or they had something else going on for them that just made them unable to meet our needs emotionally. We carry those exact same patterns into our adulthood, both into our parenting, but also our marriage relationships, our friendships, and ultimately our relationship with God. The way that we it's essentially our internal map for the way that relationships work for the rest of our lives.
So for the person who's listening, or maybe just myself who's thinking, oh my goodness, what if I've already messed up in this area? What if I have been less than connected? What if I've maybe not built trust like I should? And I'm sure anyone who's listening that has kids is going racking their brain right now, and I know that mom guilt is a real thing.
It is,
and all of that. There's help us understand if we have maybe taken some unhealthy patterns. We have a less than ideal pattern. What would you say we do? How can we make this a day one where we kind of build some new disciplines?
Absolutely. This is one of my favorite things to talk about because obviously we're not perfect. No person is perfect. No parent is perfect. No relationship is perfect. And so the beautiful thing is that in Scripture, in Psalm 139, it says that we're fearfully and wonderfully made. And part of the way that God created our brains biologically is that they're plastic. And what I mean by that is we have research has shown that they grow and change over the course of our lifetime. Our brain doesn't just stop growing and it doesn't stop healing. And so Karen Purvis, who is the former director of the Karen Purvis Institute of Child Development at Texas Christian University, which is a great resource, used to say that what fires together, wires together. And she says that it's taken from the Hebbian principle. And what that means is a pattern that we repeat over and over and over. There's actually a physiological process that's happening in our brain that creates a neural pathway. But the good news is that just because we have neural pathways, our brain changes and heals over a lifetime. And so in Romans, when it talks about being renewed and transforming your mind, it's not just talking about the spiritual. It's talking about the physiological in our brain. So there is always hope. We have the ability to go back and to rewire not only our own brains, but our children's brains as well.
Wow.
And so it's never too late. There's always hope.
Yeah.
And the expectation is not perfection. We recently have taught a class called The 6 Needs of Every Child, and it's a great book. And one of the principles that they discuss in that book is good enough is good enough. It's not about being perfect, but it's about being a good enough parent. So anytime that we have noticed that maybe we have met those needs in a less than ideal way, we always have the opportunity to go back and begin it again new each day.
Wow.
Every morning we have that opportunity, moment to moment we have that opportunity. And there's a really neat concept called rupture and repair, which you might have heard about before. It's pretty common in the parenting world. But basically, if we rupture or we make a mistake, it actually builds a stronger relationship if we go back to our child and tell them, hey, buddy, I messed up. I shouldn't have done this, or I shouldn't have lost my temper and yelled at you, or I shouldn't have gotten frustrated. Will you forgive me? It actually builds the pathway in the brain for forgiveness, but it models for our kids what to do when we make mistakes so that they don't begin to have this belief system inside themselves that they have to be perfect either.
Is that kind of like another one of those loops? Is that, maybe a different version? So there's the bottle in the middle of the night, or changing the diaper as a baby, but maybe as a middle schooler or high schooler, essentially, does that like close a type of loop if there's forgiveness? Maybe not.
I would say yes. So absolutely. Anytime that we make a mistake or we don't respond the way that we wish we should have, we go back, and it does. I mean, I would say it does close that loop. It actually builds the structure in the brain for the act of forgiveness.
Yeah.
It models it. We often hear people that talk about parenting say that more is caught than taught, right? And we often have this mindset, do what I say, not what I do. But we really need them to do what we're doing. We have to actually model what we want them to learn how to do. So I don't know if you've ever heard, if you go and break a bone, they put a cast on it, they set it, that bone, the area that was broken actually grows back stronger than the area it was before it broke. And it's the same with our relationships, not just our parent-child relationships, but other relationships as well. So if you mess up in your marriage or you mess up in a friendship and you go back and you repair that rupture, it actually builds more connection and more intimacy and more vulnerability to admit that I made a mistake and repair it.
That's good. Because I think I needed to hear that. Just the sense of like, man, hey, you're not going to be perfect. No parent is an expert on day one. Read all the books, do all the things. That's fine. It's cute, but like you're going to learn some stuff. And I maybe it's just this true for everybody, but parenting is kind of an experiment. And you don't really know if you like passed the test until they're like, I don't know, 30, and then by then it's like, well, okay, they didn't turn out so good, but you've got different stage. I'm even thinking of someone who's got like high schoolers and might not have paid attention to this until this very moment, but that can be a new day and a new start to begin to build that. And so, man, thank you so much. That's super helpful. Again, just to hear, I think we all need to hear like, no one's perfect. Good enough is going to rail against like our overachievers that are listening. The 4.0 GPA.
I'm going to raise my hand because that's me.
That was not ever me. And so I'm like, good enough. Great. Because that's all I was ever shooting for. But, okay. So for those of us that are like thrilled with this conversation, where can we go and get more info or learn more? So there's books, authors, resources.
Absolutely. So there is a plethora of content. I feel like attachment is Pandora's box. And so a couple of really great resources that we have found within Legacy 68.5 to be super helpful for us. The first one, if you're looking for something as a parent to read about attachment and how your attachment is formed with your child, Dan Siegel is a great resource. Any of his books are wonderful. They're not written from a Christian perspective, but the neuroscience in them is really easy to understand. And ultimately, we believe that God created the brain and He created relationships. So He's giving us an insight and a window into God's creation of our own brains. And one of the books that he writes is called The Power of Showing Up. And he really explains and addresses attachment in that book. So that's a great resource. It's really easy to read. If you're looking more for a resource on attachment in adult relationships, The Way We Love is written by Milan and Kay Yurkovic. And that's all about marriage and the way that our attachment plays out in our marriage relationships.
Wow.
And one thing that's really important to note is if we have less than a less than ideal attachment pattern, even as adults, we can go back and repair that.
Yeah.
There's something called earned secure attachment. So a secure attachment would be when our needs are met consistently. And when we have this belief system that we have value, we have worth, I can use my words, my voice to get my needs met, I essentially have confidence that the people around me genuinely care about me and are concerned. And if I have an issue, I can speak out about it. I'm confident, I'm secure. If we don't have that kind of pattern, we can work towards earned secure attachment. And one of the most powerful things that I think I've learned in the last couple of years is that often when it comes to parenting or to giving care, the first thing that we need to work on isn't actually our kids, it's ourselves.
Wow.
We have to go back and work on our own wounds and our own history and our own story so that what comes out of us in the moment or what comes out of us when we're not actually in this mindset of like, okay, I'm going to do this and I'm going to do this, right? When your kid does something super annoying, we often don't have the time to stop and think,
Right.
okay, I'm going to respond this way because I read this book and this
So I'm
is
saying
what they
all
said.
the intentionality is burned in those first couple years.
Absolutely.
And then I've got middle schoolers, and I'm like, stop! What are you
Right.
doing? Why are you being
Right.
so weird?
Right.
So I did, but I put a quick button on it, and I walk away. That does not help build attachment.
It doesn't.
Okay.
So the most helpful thing is really for us to go back and look at our own story as adults, because the things that have affected us are wounds that we have left buried and that we haven't dealt with and we haven't brought to the light and let Jesus heal. The things that we have not acknowledged, those come out of us when we're tired, when we're angry, when we're frustrated, when we're hungry. Those are the things that leak out in those moments. And that's how we end up rupturing to begin with.
Yeah.
And so those two resources are really great. They will help you begin to go back and look at your own story.
Yeah.
So I think the biggest piece of advice I would give is just to know that it's not always going to be about your child. It's mostly about yourself and the way that you give care because of the way you were cared for.
Wow. Okay, so I'm realizing, and I know we are about to wrap it up, but you've kind of opened up
Pandora's box.
a new section of this for me. The marriage section, just kind of the self section. I know that Yurkovic, you said his name was, right?
Yes.
I'm sure they address this in the book, but can you give us a glimpse off the top of your head how someone might like begin to wrestle with their own stuff? And because I think about it and I think I hear so much about people talk about their childhood and unpacking stuff. And I have friends that are in counseling. I have friends that are in church communities and community groups. What are some maybe basic, easy entry pathways for someone to maybe begin to unpack that? Because I have to imagine busy mom, busy dad, busy person, whatever, is just out living in this world in the middle of the rat race, and they don't stop to unpack their junk.
Right.
And so what is maybe a basic path? I mean, we work at Houston's First Baptist Church. We would say like get involved in some sort of church community, but what are some other ways that people might begin to like pause and reflect? And maybe counseling is the best option. What do you think?
Counseling is definitely a great option, especially if you have a counselor who understands attachment. But anytime that we find that we have a really big reaction to something, I like to think of those things as those warning lights that come up on your dashboard in your car. And often we push those back down and we just kind of breeze by them and we don't pay attention to them. But if we're driving a car and we leave those warning lights
Yeah.
on our dashboard on too
Car will
long,
break
like
down.
something really catastrophic happens. I've
Yeah.
learned this the hard way, right? Your
Yeah.
oil light comes on, you just keep driving, you're going to ruin your car.
Yeah.
It's the same thing with our bodies and our emotions and our connections with other people. And so I would say the easiest or the first step would be to acknowledge when you have those really big emotions or those really big reactions and to be curious. Why did I respond that way? Why do I have such a strong emotion about that? And we are not great in the U.S. or in America or even in the church about acknowledging our emotions and talking about them. So Dan Siegel has a strategy in the Whole Brain Child that's called Name It to Tame It. And when we actually acknowledge an emotion and put a name to it, it removes some of the power that it has over us. So I think being curious, paying attention when we have really big reactions, and then actually making time and space to sit down and think through and process that. The easiest way for me to do that is to journal. I'm not a journaler. I'm not a person that sits down and writes out what happened to me every day. But I have established a practice where anytime I'm walking through something that's really difficult, or I have something that's really challenging, or some big emotion during the day that popped up, I do make sure that I go back and I have time to journal and just to write it out and to really think through, why did I react that way? So, okay, this is what happened in this moment, but what's underneath that? When was the last time I felt that way? How old did I feel in that moment?
Yeah.
Are there any memories that are associated with that emotion?
Sheesh.
And then really going back, and often those things are tied to memories and events that have occurred in our lives that have absolutely nothing to do with the present moment. Because of the way that our brain stores memory. It's attached to emotion. And then if we find that we have these memories that are really troubling and really painful, it is always a good idea to go and get help. We like to say that healthy people get help. And so counseling is a great way to go back and talk through some of those painful memories, especially if your childhood had a lot of really difficult things that we would classify as trauma or abuse or neglect. That's always a good idea. Community is also really helpful. Part of the way that we learn to build trusting relationships, but also process our emotions and our pain in a way that's healthy, is to tell our story to an empathetic listener. Somebody who's really connected and attuned and is paying attention, that doesn't dismiss the pain of our story or the difficulty of whatever it was that we experienced. And just the act of telling somebody who's actually attuned to us and empathetic starts that healing process and makes space for the Holy Spirit to come in and do the work that he wants to do. And then I think that that's really pivotal and key too. Whatever method you use, ultimately surrendering it to the Lord and asking him to come and heal whatever that memory is, and giving it over to him.
So you're saying don't stuff it down.
Absolutely
and
not.
not deal with it. I've never, ever avoided dealing with my junk.
Me either. We're basically emotional hoarders,
Yeah.
right? We see that TV show Hoarders, and we look at those houses and think, oh my gosh, I could never live like that. But essentially, that's what we do with our emotions. We just stuff them all down. And if you think about a physical wound, right? If you go for a hike and you get a cut on your leg, none of us would say, well, maybe some people, right? Really
You'd be
extreme
shocked
people
how dismissive I am
say, you know,
of my own wounds.
Just rub some dirt on it or slap a Band-Aid on that thing. It'll be fine. We have to wash it out. We have to use antiseptic. And if we don't, right, then it gets infected and it gets disgusting. And then it's a whole lot harder to deal with. So it's the same thing with our emotions. And so really the first step is acknowledging them, paying attention to them. They don't get to have control, but they do tell us things about our inner world and our inner life. And so submitting them to the Holy Spirit is really helpful.
Goodness gracious. Well, listen, thank you for this free counseling session. Send me
welcome.
the bill. No, seriously, thank you. Attachment is not something that has been on the top of my mind or a topic of conversation among many of my guy friends. And so this is for sure something that we'll all benefit from. So thank you for doing what you do.
Absolutely.
And just, can you please come back and do like a part 2? Because
I would love to.
There's more that I'd like to unpack, but I'm going to let you go. So thank you so much for being with us.
You're welcome.